The Senate getting ready to start debating the House-passed reconciliation bill. Our next guest says the math doesn't add up, and he's calling for changes. Joining us right now is Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. Good morning to you, Senator. We were just talking to the president's son, in fact. What would it take for you to support this bill?
Well, the main thing that I object to is raising the debt ceiling $4 or $5 trillion. That's an indication that we'll borrow that much. It's an indication that we'll put the debt on the back burner. We'll have no more discussion of it for a year or two. And really, we're locked in a year right now where in March of this year, most of the Republicans, not me, voted to continue the Biden spending levels in March. So we're operating under a continuing resolution which originated as Biden spending levels. You remember Republicans saying, Bidenomics, Biden inflation, Biden this, Biden that. Well, they voted for that in March. So the deficit here at the end of the fiscal year, at the end of September, will be about $2.2 trillion. I'm not for that, so I voted against the spending levels. But now they want me to vote for $5 trillion worth of increase in a debt ceiling, and I'm just not for that. That's not conservative.
So the question is, you know, when you look around the room and you look at your peers and colleagues, how many people do you think you have with you? What does this bill ultimately look like in the end?
You know, I think there are 3 or 4 of us. If there are 4 of us who want it to be more fiscally conservative, I think we can reduce the spending levels and perhaps separate out the debt ceiling as well. But it takes 4 people with courage, and 4 people with courage can make the bill into anything we want it to. Right now, there are competing factions, though. There are 4 or 5 who don't want any spending cuts, and there are 4 or 5 who want more spending cuts. So it's who sticks together better and who has more courage to stand up and say no. I've said no for 6 months now. I said I will not vote to raise the debt ceiling $5 trillion, but I'm pretty much open to compromise on everything else in the bill. I want to make the tax cuts permanent. I supported them in 2017. I think it's the best thing we did for the economy. It's why the economy thrived in the first Trump term until it was shut down by the pandemic. So I do want the tax cuts. I want them to be permanent. I'm for a lot of spending cuts, but I'll compromise and get as much as I can. I'm just not going to take responsibility for the debt. The debt has always been a Democrat problem and a big government problem. Once this bill votes and this debt ceiling goes through, the debt is owned by the GOP, and there is no more campaigning and saying this is the Democrats. It will be owned by the Republicans, and I think that's a huge mistake.
Different question. If you had to cut this budget to effectively make it balance, or at least make yourself feel like it is a fiscally responsible bill, what would you actually cut?
Everywhere. What I've proposed in the past is something called the penny plan, which is a percentage of everything, but it includes all the mandatory spending, all the discretionary spending. And for a long time, 1% cut everywhere would balance. Now it's up to about a 6% cut. So I've offered a budget last year, and I'll offer one again this year that is about 6% of everything. Now, could you do that without cutting people off of Medicare and Social Security? Absolutely. I think there's 6% of inefficiency in both programs, but we did the opposite. In December of last year, Vice President Vance came over and they campaigned and they lobbied to expand Social Security by $100 billion. At that time, I put forward an amendment to gradually raise the age of Social Security. And people say, oh, my goodness, it's the third rail. Do you hate old people? And I say, no, I aspire to be an old person. But the thing is, we have to fix these programs. You will have to gradually raise the age, but I got 3 votes. So people in Congress aren't ready for this, but I've been talking about this publicly across the country and in my state. And people come up and say, well, you're right. It isn't easy, but we will have to raise the age of Medicare and of Social Security. But right now, there is not enough courage in Congress to do that, other than myself and a handful of others.
Senator, when you talk about these competing factions, the 4 or 5 of you who want to cut spending versus the 4 or 5 of you who don't want cuts, what determines who wins out on that front? Because that's kind of where all the handicapping is taking place right now.
Intestinal fortitude, who has the strength of character to say no, and you have to say no in the end. You have to say no unless they will change the bill. And that's what I've said from the beginning. I'm open to voting for the bill. I'm open to compromise on the bill. I'm just not open to supporting $5 trillion. This will, in debt ceiling increase, this will be the first time the debt ceiling's ever been increased by all Republicans. It'll be the first time that conservatives lose their moral high ground by voting for a debt ceiling increase, and not a small debt ceiling increase. This will be historically the greatest increase in the debt ceiling ever in our history. at a time when we're having trouble selling the 10-year bond. We're having interest rates at 5%. We also are having the interest payment over $1 trillion. Imagine what happens if the interest payment doubled. We're paying on average about 3.5% now. We were paying 1.7% on the debt. What if it doubles again? I think it'll be unmanageable. It'll crowd out all other spending. So I think we have to draw a line in the sand and take a stand here.
I bring this up because we had Senator Mark Wayne Mullen on yesterday, who's negotiating between the White House, the House, and the Senate on this, and trying to keep everybody on the same page. Joe pointed out earlier, he brought up Susan Collins earlier, while he was talking to us about that. If they're giving kind of praise to her at this point, does that mean they've given up on you, thinking they're not going to win you, so they're going to work on that other side?
Maybe, but we're also going to have another inflection point right now. We're going to vote on a rescission package. I've been bugging the administration for months. They're going to send us one, a very paltry $9 billion. But this is the country's going to be able to view this. If those Republicans who cannot cut $9 billion, the whole country needs to know who they are and why they can't cut $9 billion. Because if we can't cut $9 billion in foreign aid welfare, the country's doomed. This is $9 billion. This is a rounding error. This should be something we should do every day. But that's coming up also. It's the same people who don't want to touch Medicaid, who don't want to look at Medicare, who don't want to look at Social Security, who don't want to touch any of the entitlements. They're the same people saying they won't cut $9 billion in foreign aid welfare. So push is going to come to shove on this, and I've been pushing hard on the administration. We need to have this vote, and we need to see where the chips lie. And if people can't support any cuts, the whole American public needs to know who they are.
Senator, I have a political question for you. It comes to the midterms. And actually, maybe it's the bond market. Maybe they're combined. Do you think if this bill goes through or some version of it and you don't get what you want, that your colleagues are going to pay for that? Or do you think that the public is accepting of this, wants this?
I think the most important thing coming up in the near future is the second quarter growth. We had negative growth in the first quarter, and that was somewhat offset by huge amounts of imports pouring in at the last point to try to avoid the tariffs. If we have negative growth in the second quarter, I think you're going to see a generalized freak out by all the protectionists and all those wanting to, throw this tariff, that tariff, and in a really reckless way around. You're going to see a reassessment if we have negative growth in the second quarter. I can't predict the future, but if we do, I think Katie bar the door. There's really going to be an upset around here.
You wish that we didn't have some of the populist tax cuts in this bill? Would you take all of those out, Senator?
No, I'm a big believer in the Laffer curve. I think the tax cuts actually do pay for themselves. So I have not been a stickler and really don't accept the CBO argument that the tax cuts are leading to a drain on the Treasury.
I wasn't talking about the 2017. I don't even know if I'd call that populist, but tax on tips, some of the other things that overtime, things like that. That made it even more difficult to get it paid for.
If you were designing a tax code, you'd do lower rates for everybody versus singling out special groups to have no tax. But I wouldn't oppose the no tax on tips simply because I think it does have some popularity. It's not the ideal way to do a tax code, but I would support it. But really, in the end, the problem is the mandatory spending and having it be off limits, and the fact that we know the appropriation process that's coming forward again isn't any better than last year. There's been no change in sentiment by Republicans or Democrats around here, and the fact that they're going to borrow $5 trillion is what alarms me. If you borrow $5 trillion, they will spend $5 trillion, and that is $5 trillion they don't have. They will borrow that to make up for spending more than comes in. So I really think that there needs to be a wake-up call. The bond market is already showing this, but I think if growth numbers come in either poor or weak in the second quarter, there's going to be a lot, I think, more vocal opposition to these tariffs than just me.